Burkina Faso just unleashed its most powerful military strike yet, wiping out hundreds of insurgents, many with backing from foreign powers. But this isn't just a story about rebels hiding in the jungle. Something far deeper is unfolding. Who's really bankrolling this chaos? Why has Burkina Faso become the epicenter of such conflict? And more importantly, how did a nation the West once dismissed as weak turn the tide and crush these forces? Let's find out. What comes to mind when you hear the name Burkina Faso? Most likely not foreign-made guns, satellite phones, or rebel cells. Nevertheless, this peaceful West African country has developed into one of the world's most strategically densely populated combat zones in recent years. It's because of what it stands for, not because of what it possesses: opposition. The vultures were drawn here not by oil. A government that is unwilling to bow down is a greater threat to influential international players. Armed forces claiming loyalty to insurgency groups have been flooding Burkina Faso since 2015. This is not a case of dispersed warlords engaging in tribal politics. These transnational militias are well connected and operate with military accuracy. They go across borders with ease. They use Western apps that are encrypted to communicate. They are too well organized to be renegade bandits and arrive with weaponry too sophisticated for desert raiders. So how did this occur? Ironically, the footprints of the very nations who profess to be fighting insurgency hold the key to the solution, as does the void created by international meddling. The region's militant violence did not decrease despite years of multinational coalitions, so-called peacekeeping efforts, especially the French-led Operation Barkhane. It blew up. The number of insurgent strongholds seems to increase with the number of counter-insurgency operations. And from where did these rebels originate? From Niger, from Mali, from the very corridors of battle where, in the past, foreign forces had used one hand to drop humanitarian goods and the other to launch drone strikes. A peculiar pattern emerged when those same forces started to be driven out, when Mali, later Burkina Faso, began expelling Western diplomats and soldiers. It wasn't a random spike in violence. It became more ruthless, more surgical, and above all, more intent on destroying the new leadership. That means challenging the legitimacy of Captain Ibrahim Traoré's administration in Burkina Faso. Is it a coincidence or a result? Add your voice to the total liberation of Africa by leaving a comment in the comments section below. Do not forget to like and subscribe for more informative videos like this one. Let's proceed. Let's be clear. Sahelian insurgency has always been a risky situation. However, something more profound is currently taking place. These are not disorganized rebels seeking a cause. Many are destabilizing instruments intentionally or inadvertently employed to exert pressure on regimes that oppose outside authority. Consider it. In a nation like Burkina Faso, who gains from chaos? Foreign mining firms seeking cheap gold, arms dealers seeking markets, and governments fearing a growing Africa that ceases pleading for aid are the ones who are affected, not the farmers, villagers, or the children going 20 kilometers to school. Without a doubt, Burkina Faso is wealthy, not in the ostentatious sense of having oil reserves, but rather in strategic gold mines, untapped energy, agricultural potential, and possibly most alarmingly for the West, a growing desire for statehood. The true danger is that there is no better way to hold that momentum than to inundate the country with war. It exhausts local leadership, generates humanitarian headlines, allows for immediate intervention, and above all, provides cover for shadow forces and proxy actors who wish to see Burkina Faso weak, divided, and dependent. It gets darker here though. For a long time, regional intelligence sources have cautioned about international organizations arming and funding moderate rebel groups, only to watch those same rebels turn into insurgents. In the Middle East, the same old tactic is employed. Prepare a militia to fight an enemy, then pretend to be shocked when it becomes an insurgent force. The pattern is repeating in the Sahel after Afghanistan, Syria, and Libya. Burkina Faso, on the other hand, is not doing as planned. Traoré's Burkina Faso is playing the bluff, in contrast to other nations that accepted foreign soldiers and gave up their autonomy in the name of stability. They are posing questions, not requesting airstrikes. Why are they targeting us? Who are these combatants? Why does their army have superior equipment than ours? And as our people go hungry, who keeps paying them? And the pressure is increasing precisely for that reason. In addition to being attacked by militants, Burkina Faso is also being penalized for having an independent thought process. The insurgents are pawns, yes. But pawns still carry blades. And those knives are being used to bleed out a whole country before its revolution can completely blossom because the West no longer controls the board. So when Traoré launched his counteroffensive and neutralized hundreds of terrorists, it wasn't just a military triumph, it was a message. A statement stating that Burkina Faso is aware of the game being played and is no longer participating. However, if Traoré is chopping off the insurgents' limbs, then who is instigating this chaos? What is the extent of the betrayal? Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not rise. Instead, he erupted in a territory suffocated by foreign military posts, NGO flags, and loan agreements written in languages that the majority of the local population does not understand, and not from a prestigious academy or palace. He was a product of the front lines, the barracks, and the dusty ditches where true warriors buried their friends, not political foes. His rise wasn't smooth or orchestrated. Rather, it was hurried, irate, and based on the fatigue of seeing his nation suffer while the story was written by foreigners. Burkina Faso needed a shield, a hammer, and someone who would not only control turmoil, but also have the guts to take down the system that created it. It didn't need a statesman in a suit or a career politician. That man was Traoré. The international media hardly paid him any attention when he came to power in 2022, at the age of just 34. They dismissed him as a youthful commander, as though age was a disqualifier for resistance. However, they failed to see that this was a uniformed liberation movement rather than a political one. Thousands of Burkina Faso residents observed a leader who listened, despite the West labeling him a military dictator. A leader who squatted on the ground in war-torn communities, listening to tales the rest of the world ignored, rather than grinning for cameras in Brussels. And he broke the norm as soon as he took office. The old model was straightforward. A crisis arises, the West offers assistance, Western forces show up, resources are secured, and nothing gets better. Burkina Faso remained unstable, but under permanent care under that arrangement. No patient was ever permitted to leave the intensive care unit. Traoré, however, disconnected the devices. His first big action: stopping military assistance to France. Just a fresh start, without any hesitancy or compromise. Traoré stated what the majority of African leaders muttered behind closed doors after over 10 years of fruitless foreign intervention. "You're not here to protect us, you're here to protect your interests." Stunned, humiliated, and incensed, the French troops packed up and departed. The impact was immediate. Overnight, Western media narratives hardened, training programs were suspended, aid deliveries were paused, and intelligence networks were cut off. Traoré was suddenly not a democracy, but in Burkina Faso, bullets had never been stopped by democracy. It never provided soldiers with appropriate boots or shielded people from rebels. It had only produced regimes that were decaying on the inside but appeared stable on the exterior. Even more contentious was Traoré's second move: inviting military instructors from Russia to join. It was more than just strategy. Signaling that Burkina Faso would select its partners was the goal. It had nothing to do with ideology. Traoré had no intention of participating in Cold War cosplay. He was saying something. "We'll find someone who respects our sovereignty if the West doesn't." There was no colonial history, a long list of IMF requirements, or covert threats when Russian instructors arrived. Their approach was based on military pragmatism. Burkina Faso's dignity will never longer be exchanged for aid or funny security, Traoré made plain. However, these choices came with a risk. Those who had previously operated under French supervision did not just vanish when French forces withdrew, leaving a void. Following their reorganization, rebranding, and rearmament, there was an increase in targeted strikes against infrastructure, government officials, and villages thought to be supportive of the new government. It wasn't arbitrary. It was a form of discipline. Traoré did not, however, back down. He launched forceful offensives into areas where the enemy had long been permitted to establish their presence, strengthened local militias, and enhanced supply routes to frontline soldiers. Questions concerning the global scope of Burkina Faso's instability were raised when hundreds of militants were either terminated or caught in a matter of months, some of whom had connections that suggested foreign funding. Furthermore, many Africans saw clarity in action, despite Western detractors labeling his approaches excessive. Here was someone who stood up for his people without asking permission, after years of listening to leaders talk as their nations burned. However, this gave rise to a new type of adversary, one that possessed influence rather than a firearm. Rumors of dubious meetings and dissatisfaction inside the military started to spread. The term coup began to appear in encrypted calls and telegram channels. Ultimately, how can a rising leader who rejects ownership be stopped? You incite his troops to oppose him. This brings us to the next phase in this war's unraveling, which takes place inside the military itself rather than on the battlefield. An internal treason that almost brought down the revolution. Bullets are less effective than betrayal when a revolution threatens too many influential individuals. A much more serious threat was emerging in early 2025 as Burkina Faso's troops destroyed insurgent cells and recaptured villages. Not in rebel camps or the woods, but within the same army that was meant to defend the country. Additionally, a small group of insiders was discreetly trying to destroy everything Ibrahim Traoré had constructed while the rest of the world was preoccupied with propaganda, battlefield reports, and drone footage of burned-out vehicles. Winning the battle wasn't necessary for them. All they had to do was open the gate from inside. It was a bold scheme that nearly succeeded. Known rebel groups, some of which had just lost important territory and resources to the national army, started collaborating with a network of unhappy troops, mid-ranking commanders, and intelligence defectors. They weren't radicals in terms of ideology. They were strategic traitors who pretended to be loyal, while plotting in secret to overthrow the leadership they had formerly admired. The most unsettling aspect, realignment, not with Russia or the Burkina Faso people, was their aim, not just political dominance or retaliation. However, everything had returned to normal, with the same foreign handlers that Traoré had expelled. There was more to it than a coup attempt. A counter-revolution occurred. It was planned to be a phased operation. First, politically isolate Traoré. He was portrayed as neurotic, dishonest, and even mentally ill in rumors that were spread around secret forums and WhatsApp groups. Destabilize frontline morale by disseminating false information about purported Russian meddling, fictitious defeats, and desertions. Then incite unrest in the capital at the same time, deflect attention from the troops, and instill terror among the streets. Last but not least, a group within the military would launch an internal uprising, take control of the presidential mansion, and promptly demand international stabilization. The objective: establish a transitional council that has been authorized by the West and return Burkina Faso to a democratic system. However, the plan's failure was not due to carelessness. Traoré knew it was coming, which is why it failed. Several security sources claimed that weeks prior to the coup, quiet suspicions were raised by intercepted contacts between certain soldiers and well-known insurgency commanders. Names were mentioned, coordinates were addressed, and in a few texts, foreign consular codes. the type only used in encrypted exchanges with state-level actors, appeared. The language was clear. Instead of reacting with public purges or dramatic arrests, Traoré allowed the conspiracy to unfold just long enough to identify all parties. The network was then neutralized in a single forceful sweep. They made arrests. Urban safe houses were found to contain secret caches of foreign currency and weapons. Furthermore, the coup had already been put down in silence by the time the news reached the public. However, handcuffs weren't the end of the fight. Even ardent followers were shaken by the investigation's findings. The conspirators collaborated with international middlemen linked to intelligence activities in nearby nations in addition to rebels. These players have been closely monitoring internal changes in Burkina Faso and were now looking for a way back in after conventional influence was lost. By coercion, if required. For the Traoré administration, this was a watershed moment. The realization was obvious. Not all adversaries yell insurgent slogans or don turbans. National uniforms are worn by some. Some people are fluent in French. Diplomatic passports are held by some. Traoré conducted an internal review of the military's chain of command and tightened command structures as a result. The units were reorganized. Senior officials with inexplicable wealth were quietly fired. They implemented a new layer of community-based intelligence. Villages are equipped with trustworthy civilians who can report any questionable military activity. It was the beginning of a security model driven by people that no foreign blueprint could imitate. However, the wounds persisted. Despite failing, the coup attempt left a grim lesson. Invasion does not lead to the collapse of sovereignty. Through penetration, it falls apart. And that meant a never-ending fight on two fronts for Burkina Faso. One against shadowy double agents, the other against bush-dwelling militants. However, neither the army barracks nor the woodland were the most hazardous battlefields of all. It was the thin line separating suspicion from survival. Particularly when ethnic conflicts are turned into weapons and ordinary people start to resemble fighters. And the following front would appear just there. It was almost impossible to tell friend from foe in the villages where people lived. What would happen then if you were asked to choose a side with a gun to your head when battle arrived at your door? There comes a time when the front lines become indistinct in every conflict. And that blur starts in the villages of Burkina Faso. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's government was thrust into a new type of battlefield after thwarting a military coup linked to terrorists and foreign controllers. One that is identified by identity rather than geography. And the Fulani communities dotted throughout the north and east of the country were the most unstable areas of that battlefield. From Senegal to Nigeria, the Fulani, also called the Pool, are a nomadic ethnic group that inhabits West Africa. There are millions of them in Burkina Faso. The Fulani are semi-settled farmers, traders, and cattle herders who have historically lived in conflict areas. However, in the counter-insurgent struggle, they have become the most dangerously stereotyped and misunderstood group in recent years. This is the reason. Fulani populations are a major source of recruitment for an increasing number of insurgent cells active in Burkina Faso. The causes are multifaceted. Many young Fulani males are susceptible to radical narratives because of their poverty, marginalization, lack of education, and the degradation of traditional livelihoods brought on by land disputes and climate change. Jihadist commanders, who are frequently Fulani, take advantage of these divisions by promising loyalty in exchange for cash, safety, and a distorted sense of purpose. However, certain members of the Burkina-based security establishment have succumbed to a destructive logic, rather than distinguishing the rebel recruiters from the innocent majority. The Fulani are rebels. The battle takes its most heinous turn at this point. Some Fulani have undoubtedly joined insurgent groups, on the one hand. In several instances, entire villages have cooperated by providing rebels with information, food, and shelter in return for safety. The distinction between combatants and civilians has actually become more hazy in certain regions. Additionally, it becomes more difficult to control the need for vengeance when soldiers lose fellow soldiers to IEDs planted on rural roads outside of these same communities. However, the great majority of Fulani are innocent people caught between military suspicion and militant compulsion. Additionally, the insurgents' recruitment narrative is only strengthened by each misguided raid and mass burial. The statement, "Look how they treat your people. Look what your country has become. We are your only protection," becomes simple for revolutionary preachers. Not only is this unfortunate, but it's also calculated. The weaponization of ethnicity is a tactic, not a consequence of conflict. And a lot of people think it's a purposeful one, meant to splinter the country and prevent real independence. After all, it is far simpler to control a split Burkina Faso than a united one. The longer the violence lasts, the more militant groups recruit Fulani and the more alienated they get. Ideal circumstances for foreign powers to re-enter under pretenses of mediation or peacekeeping. Nevertheless, something extraordinary is taking place. Local Fulani leaders have started speaking out against the militants who are abusing their name, rather than the military, in opposition of this trend. Elders are organizing state-aligned defense units, conducting peace talks, and even helping to identify foreign-trained agents who may be entrenched among them. Under reintegration programs, several Fulani fighters who previously belonged to insurgent groups have rejoined the government and offered vital intelligence in return for amnesty. The global media frequently overlooks this. Ethnic conflict is not erupting in Burkina Faso. In the face of criticism, it is attempting to create a new model of unity by clawing its way out of one. Few nations can win this balancing act, much less survive it. However, it appears that Traoré's government is dedicated to a time when being Fulani won't be a source of terror. Statements alone, however, will not enough. Trust will be necessary. And only when there is no betrayal can trust develop. What occurs, however, when betrayal is not only political or ethnic, but also concealed inside global narratives and power structures that destabilize while claiming to protect? We'll go there next. The pattern becomes more obvious the more you examine the Burkina Faso crisis. This is not merely an insurgency battle. It is a conflict with a country that is attempting to establish its independence. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's troops were accused of attacking residents when they made a forceful advance through districts with a Fulani majority. They were accused of violating human rights as they invaded insurgent positions. They were seen as autocratic after overthrowing a coup supported by foreign powers. But why is the nation on trial suddenly the one defending itself? What Burkina Faso is doing right, at least by African norms of sovereignty, is the answer, not what it is doing wrong. To put it plainly, Traoré's administration has rejected the idea of becoming a client state. It moved to non-Western partnerships, rejected the French military presence, revealed the shortcomings of Western peacekeeping operations, and started allocating its resources to the recovery of its own industry, rather than export pipelines to Europe. In the center of the former French Empire, this was not meant to occur. Every action taken by Burkina Faso is therefore closely examined, misrepresented, and reframed as a democratic issue. But if you look closely, you'll see that disruption, not democracy, is the true issue. Traoré's defiance of colonial norms jeopardizes not only French power, but also the meticulously preserved myth that African countries cannot manage themselves without outside assistance. For this reason, the global media narrative places restoring democracy above combating insurgency. This simple term has been used to justify invasions, occupations, sanctions, coups, and occupations from Iraq to Haiti. And possibly next on that list is Burkina Faso. Traoré and his supporters, however, are proactively changing the playbook, in contrast to those countries. Together with Mali and Nigeria, They have formed the Sahel States, a ES alliance, a daring trilateral defense pact that places a premium on regional autonomy and opposes neo-colonial intrusion. They are working together to create intelligence networks, pool resources for border security, and adopt policies that put local control ahead of foreign control. It is an African firewall against recolonization, not only an alliance, and gently but surely it's working. Once able to roam freely across Sahelian borders, insurgent groups are now being surrounded. Important transit channels that were previously utilized to carry gold and weapons are being closed. Most significantly, the general public's attitude is changing from one of fear to resistance in many rural places. When villagers start to reject insurgent demands because they think their government might, for once, defend them, this is the bit that no international briefing discusses. This development, of course, is brittle. The pressure on the economy is tremendous. Burkina Faso's separation from the West has resulted in media warfare, financial isolation, and sanctions. Sharp-tongued opinion pieces in European publications and cautions from international think institutes follow every move Traoré makes. Funding for aid organizations has decreased. The concept of humanitarian access has been re-examined. A number of development packages have been put on hold by the World Bank due to institutional issues. However, one disturbing reality emerges from all of this. Global power institutions view insurgency as acceptable. It's not independence. A leader is doing his best if he collaborates with Western forces and is unable to halt insurgent attacks. However, he becomes a warlord overnight if he dares to defend his people without Washington's or Paris' approval. The scenario in Burkina Faso demonstrates how the war against insurgency is being used as a smokescreen, a flexible justification that, depending on your supporters, may either bring you favor or punishment. Because of this, Traoré's administration receives harsher treatment for executing militants than other governments for unwittingly harboring them. Because control, not morality, is at issue here. But Burkina Faso is not giving up in spite of the odds. It is investing in domestic military production rather than relying on foreign sources. It is collaborating with new international partners who are offering agreements without conditions in place of IMF loans. Additionally, it is creating a new political culture in which conventional leaders and citizens co-govern in survival mode rather than pacifying critics. It's completely African, unpolished, and dirty. The idea that a small, landlocked country exceeding all expectations could inspire others to follow suit is perhaps the thing that worries the world the most. What justification do other countries have if Burkina Faso can combat insurgents, thwart coups, manage ethnic conflicts, endure sanctions, and still forge ahead? This dilemma is not just a local one. It is a political revolution that is not readily apparent. The world must now make a decision. Will it continue to attack African independence on the pretext of combating insurgency, or will it support it? If Africans take up arms, do you think Traoré can defeat the rebellion on his own? What can you do to save your country? Tell us what you think in the comments section below. We explore the rich history, culture, and the ongoing struggle for sovereignty in Africa. Join us in this important conversation by subscribing to our channel. By subscribing, you're not just staying informed, you're becoming part of a movement dedicated to reclaiming Africa's rightful place on the global stage. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Let's work together to spread knowledge and inspire change. Thanks for watching.